Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me all right? Yes? Perfect. If not, I could just use my Jersey voice. Welcome to the 2025 Facts Climate Crisis Forum, which is our 9th. I'm Chris Topolesky, Executive Director of Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions. Okay. Thanks for being here today, and also for all of you online. We have quite a few people online, not just here in Virginia, but across the country as well. And I think it's one of the most important conversations this community can start having right now. I'd also like to thank all of our panelists for making time to be here today, and also give a shout out to our planning committee, which is made up of board members, volunteers, and our staff. So, we all know that Northern Virginia has become the world's largest hub for data centers, those massive facilities you see that store and process information behind virtually everything we do online. So they really are kind of the engines of the online digital community, but there's also no doubt that engines require fuel. And they require resources, electricity, water, and land. And their rapid growth raises some tough questions for all of us, questions about costs, communities' impacts, and the environment. That's what this forum's about today. So we brought together experts who will help us unpack what this means for Virginia's future. In our first panel here, we'll explore the impact of the data centers on consumers. Why are electricity rates going up? Will they continue to go up? Who should be shouldering the cost of those increases? And how fast will it grow? With the Virginia legislature just around the corner in January, there'll be probably dozens of bills beginning next year. What role can the community play in shaping policy going forward? And then in panel 2, we'll turn to community impacts. We'll explore what it would take to significantly increase renewable energy, move away from fossil fuels. We'll explore the impacts on the physical environment, water and land use, and also with public health costs as well, and what can be done to protect those most affected in the community by the data centers. So today's discussion came about from one question: how does this rapid expansion affect Virginia's ability to meet the goals of the Virginia Clean Economy Act, the Commonwealth's ambitious commitment to achieve zero emissions by 2050? So again, thanks for joining us. Let's dive in. I'm thrilled to welcome Ivy Main and Elena Schlossberg to our first panel. Unfortunately, due to illness, Jenna Ruddick was unable to participate today, and I'd like you both, if you would have a chance to introduce yourselves so I don't just read off a stock. So, Ivy, would you like to go first?
I'm Ivy Main. I am a lawyer and thank you. I'm Ivy Main. I'm a lawyer and a writer and an advocate. I write energy commentary for the Virginia Mercury and other outlets, including my blog, which is powerforthepeopleva.com. And I am also a volunteer energy advocate. I work on legislation and policy with my colleagues at the Sierra Club.
Elena?
My name is Elena Schlossberg, and it's fun to be back here at South Lakes. It's been about 40 years. I am a native Virginian, and I became involved in data center resources back in 2014 when a transmission line for a secretive Amazon Web Services campuses was going to cause a transmission line to run through multiple counties. And actually what we disclosed was that for the first time ever, data centers had a power demand like no other industry, and we were respondents at the State Corporate Commission, and it was really important because that set the stage for where we are today, that one tiny little campus has exploded into a global problem. And I believe that it is only through the work of citizens like you and amazing journalists like Ivy that we have been able to make a difference.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much. I'm going to put my first question to Ivy, which is, why are electricity rates going up and electricity costs going up so much? I mean, I've told in the house, I've said, in our house, we've got to keep the electricity, like the heat and the cooling like this in the house. And I look back at my bills, and I look back at what I used, the actual volume I used a year ago versus now, or months ago. And we're using less, but we're still paying as much, if not more, for our electricity bills. And will this continue to happen?
Yeah, so it is fundamentally a supply and demand problem, and we all know energy demand is skyrocketing because of data centers. So they are right at the heart of this. But it's exacerbated by poor policy choices and by poor grid management as well. So, you all remember Economics 101, if demand goes up and you don't have supply, rates go up. And that's so that the wholesale market for energy has gone up because of too much demand. Why is supply not kept up is really the issue, and that has to do with poor grid management. Our grid manager, PJM, has not been approving new generation at any kind of a rate that needed to keep up. It takes 5 years for projects to move through its line. There are projects that are ready to be built and that can't get approval to connect. And 90% of these are wind and solar and battery storage. This is across the country. These are the cleanest, cheapest energy sources. So if you're not bringing on low-cost energy, then you're not getting the benefits of lower costs. And I have seen that in doing research myself on rates. The states that have lower electricity rates than we do almost all have more renewable energy, and that's because it acts like a hedge. So part of that is this poor grid management, and then there's the policy issue. And Virginia has welcomed these data centers here without dealing with the energy problem. So we are not building energy here. We're not building the solar that we should be building and the energy storage, and that is a failure on the part of the General Assembly and the administration to rise to the challenge.
So, Ivy, a follow-up to that. Can you explain, so I think when we have different players, you have your residential customers, and you have commercial customers, and you have a utility company like Dominion, and you'll have what you mentioned, PJM. And a lot of folks who aren't really sure or maybe don't know who that is. And so I think you have a different players, and you can get, well, it's them, it's this. So there's a lot of blame around, and no one's really on the. So can you explain the role that PJM plays?
Yeah, so PJM is an organization that runs the grid. It tells when generators should turn on and off, and it makes sure that supply and demand are in sync all the time. It covers 13 states plus the District of Columbia, so it starts with New Jersey and Delaware and Virginia and Maryland over here on the east, and then it spreads to the west to include even parts of Indiana. So it's a big area, and a generator that is anywhere in PJM can, at least in theory, provide electricity to all the other areas within PJM, so they act as a sort of a referee as to what comes on, what goes off, but you can't start your generator, you can't put in a solar farm or something until you have PJM's approval, and unless you're really hyper-local. So it doesn't affect residential, doesn't affect some of the small community projects, but any of the large grid-supplied projects are going to have to work with PJM.
So what does the future hold short-term for customers' rates in their pocketbook?
So rates are going to go up. I mean, so part of this is that we don't have enough supply coming in. Part of it is that there's also the transmission end side of it. So residents are paying more than half of transmission costs so if Dominion has to build a new transmission line, you're going to pay more than half of it unless it is serving only one customer. But if it can be argued that it is serving many customers, residents are going to have to pay for it. And then rates are also going up because of the attack on renewable energy at the administration level. So we not only have seen the rollback in incentives, but also there are incentives now for more oil and gas. There are the administration has been attacking renewable energy projects. You saw them issuing a stop work order to an offshore wind farm that was 80% complete and was going to be providing energy to more than 500,000 homes. So you can't do that and also say that you are trying to keep rates down.
So you have a conflicting federal policy with what the state has already put in place with the Virginia Clean Economy Act. So
Absolutely.
there is a play between the state and the federal, and I want to use that as I want to come back on another question about residential impact, but I do want to turn it over now, ask Elena a question about when going through, we looked at the last General Assembly back in January, and there were at least 20 plus bills that were considered about data centers. A handful, were actually seriously considered. And then, I won't go numbers, only want to make it right. Only one was passed and was vetoed. So, what do you think plays into that? And what do you think the likelihood of moving meaningful legislation is in the next General Assembly, which is in January?
So first of all, I did forget to mention I started an organization at my kitchen table called the Coalition to Protect Prince William County in reaction to this transmission line that was coming through for Amazon. The first time we went to Richmond was in 2023, and we had two bills, Danica Rome and Chat Peterson. Next year we went, it was 13 bills. Next year we went, it was almost double that. So we are making progress. We are definitely making progress. We need more people. So your question is, what's going to make a difference to actually...
What can the community do to move the needle?
Okay, you guys need to start showing up. That's what will move the needle. Because what is happening is before there were certain legislators in the industry could say, oh, it's just a few NIMBY people. But now that we know, and we have proven, that your utility rates are going to rise because you are paying for their transmission. You are paying for some of the substations. So what needs to happen is more Virginians need to understand that whether you live next to a data center and you have to hear it, whether the transmission line is going to take your property via eminent domain, whether utility rates are going to double by 2030, whether you're going to breathe the dirty diesel, or whether your water quality is going to be impacted. You all need to show up. That's what will move the needle, in particular Northern Virginia. HB 1601 was that one bill. And it would have made a difference, and you would have had to the industry doesn't have to disclose how much water, how much power. So what's important to make that leap, first of all, we're going to have a different governor who needs to make commitments now that they will absolutely, hopefully Spamberger, I'm not supposed to say that, but anyway, I didn't say that out loud. So there'll be another governor, hopefully, that will understand that everyday Virginians are being impacted in every single way. And so not only will we have more bills, but they will make it through the General Assembly and they will be signed by the next governor. But that requires all of you showing up. This is not somebody else's issue. This is all of our issue.
So, and I'll just put this just a reminder that.
Sorry.
No. Having that FACTS itself is a nonpartisan organization, it's a 501c3. So we want to hold everyone accountable to it. And so whoever is in the governorship will be. Whoever is going to be our governor will be held to these standards. So, Ivy, one of the questions that you talked about before we had. Rates are going to go up, right? Rates are going to go up for individual homeowners. How do we protect them from bearing the cost? Should we look at what lessons from maybe Ohio, where their utilities commission decided that data centers would need to carry more of the weight of the build-out?
So in fact, both Dominion and Appalachian Power have proposed special rate classes to the State Corporation Commission to sort of like what happened in Ohio. So in Ohio, the local utility said, we can't protect our ratepayers, our existing ratepayers, from higher rates while serving big tech unless we put more of the onus on paying for new transmission and generation on the data centers. So their proposal would have data centers have to enter into long-term contracts. So if they said, we're going to need 200 megawatts for this data center, they would actually have to guarantee that they were going to pay for the 200 megawatts. they would have to put up collateral, they would have to pay for a portion of the transmission. And so the idea here is to shield ratepayers from at least the risk. And I think it's important that we be clear on what you can and cannot do with this approach. It is really important to protect ratepayers from stranded assets. So if the data center boom goes bust, the data centers all say, oh, we really didn't need all these data centers, or they discover that it's cheaper to go out to Utah where there's geothermal energy or something. If they pull out and Dominion has already built a bunch of generation and transmission, that leaves the rest of the ratepayers on the hook. And both Dominion and Appalachian Power know that this is a risk, and their proposals would have similar long-term contracts and guaranteed payments of a portion of the new generation and transmission costs. Unfortunately, I don't think they're as high as they ought to be. If you are asking me for 200 megawatts, I think you should have to pay for 200 megawatts. I don't think it's fair for those to be discounted. There is a ramp-up period in both cases. That's fair enough. But then the other issue is that their idea of a long-term contract is 14 years, including a ramp-up period in the case of Dominion, or 12 years plus an optional ramp-up period in the case of Appalachian Power. But if you're building generation that you expect to last 30 years, or transmission lines that'll last 50, you still have this risk to the rest of the rate base. So I understand there's always going to be risk, but I would like to see those proposals strengthened. I think the SEC will have a response. I believe they're required to come back by the end of November, so we should get a sense of what they're doing. And that will definitely help shield the ratepayers from some of the risk. I don't think that it does as much on the cost issue, the prices, because that's partly baked in from supply and demand, and our failure to build renewable energy is also a real issue here that we could be hedging. We could be building low-cost, clean energy, and Virginia is just not doing it as fast enough.
Lena, did you have anything to that? Because I want to riff a little bit off of the clean energy. So do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think I would add that what the coalition attempted to do back for this one transmission line in Haymarket was apply what was called the line extension policy, which is a novel approach. Because ultimately, these are extension cords into each data center campus, into their substation. And so that requirement that you're talking about, that transmission infrastructure, would have been put onto this large customer. There is an opportunity right now at the SEC with Piedmont Environmental Council. They are proposing that this line extension policy be revisited. It is not all the transmission. It's just that one line into the substation itself. If you think of transmission line infrastructure and electricity, think of these transmission lines as highways. And so they build a new off-ramp, off-road, whatever you want to call it, into the substation itself for the data center, but what's happening back behind them that feeds into that transmission line. So we are all still covering the cost, but there are opportunities. I'm hoping that the SEC will revisit a decades-old recommendation that the legal staff actually agreed with way back when. So that might help minimize some of those costs onto ratepayers, so fingers crossed.
So real quick, both of you mentioned the SEC. Can you quickly define their role in all of this, who they are, and what their role is in it?
So it's the State Corporation Commission. They are the regulator for our utilities, and they work with the powers that they are given by the General Assembly. They do have a role that's in the Virginia Constitution, but they are implementing the laws passed by the General Assembly.
So they have a lot of power in that.
They have a great deal of power.
So one of the things that you mentioned was clean energy. And I've noticed this subtle shift. You and I were at the conference last week where there's been a shift of this, I think, somewhat subtle from a discuss about renewable to more in the concept of clean. So I want to talk, can we talk a little bit, you know where I'm going. Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about small modular reactors, which are nuclear reactors, right? We've heard a lot of, I've heard it since I came to FACS. It's, oh, well, we just have to get there. Like, that's going to be the fix. Or, you know, once we get there, it's unlimited clean energy. Can we talk about the realistic, like how realistic is that? And at some point, who bears the cost of that? Whether it's the financial impacts or like the societal impacts of it.
Yeah, so I'm not opposed to small modular reactors in concept if you can make them economical and you can make them safe and you can deal with the waste. Now, those are three things you probably can't do. So that's so there's that. But you know, fundamentally, the very best scenario doesn't have the first ones becoming available until at best the early 2030s. Dominion has a proposal for the first one in its mix in 2035, and that is 350 megawatts, which is smaller than some of the data center campuses being built every year. So fundamentally, they are not the solution. And you know, everybody, as you say, Chris, everybody is very, if they don't want to have to come up with solutions today, small modular reactors seem like a great solution tomorrow. And you know, you should have seen the excitement at this clean energy conference over fusion energy. And it is very exciting because not only do you have boundless clean energy, but the waste is not the high-level radioactive waste. It's absolutely wonderful. In the 2040s, we should be looking for this, but it is not going to solve our data center issue. And I think that's what we're looking at, the same with ASMRs, assuming that they prove economical, and there's at the moment no sign that they could possibly compete with wind and solar. But if they can, it's still too late.
We are talking about an industry that requires too much of everything. Too much power, too much water, too much land. Why do we not flip the equation and start asking, why are we trying to meet this one industry's power demand? What are we willing to sacrifice and why? SMRs are, I love it, Julie Bolthouse, we tease about this all the time. Well, that's not funny, but I mean, it's like, you know, it's this magical fairy dust, and it's based on crushing the money from your wallets. Like, you're going to sprinkle it around, and suddenly SMRs are going to appear. They have always been 5 years away. For 40 years, fusion technology has been 5 years away. What is happening right now is gas, coal, diesel generators as microgrids when we're at peak load and the grid is so stressed we might have a blackout. There's one technology firm called NewScale. 3 times they've had contracts to build an SMR. They're always right on the edge until they're not. And then it folds. And last year in 2024 January, there was a Utility Dive article, and they said any government entity that is chasing after this technology is throwing their money away. Possibly one day it will happen, but right now, just in the state of Virginia, we have a low demand. This is old numbers. We are doubling the amount of contracts that Dominion is signing with data centers daily. It's cumulative. So in July of 2024, Dominion releases their forecast of electrical contracts they've signed with data centers. It's 23 gigawatts. That's January. Do you know what it is in December of 2024? 40. Do you know how much energy one nuclear reactor produces? Anybody? Sir? 1 gigawatt of power. 1 gigawatt of power. We have a need from December. Go ahead and double that right now if they keep signing, because there's no constraint. How many nuclear reactors just for Virginia are we going to build? And who's paying for that? And where do they go? Do you know the Department of Energy released a cartoon about a year ago? And you know what it said? It said, nuclear, your good neighbor. And it showed a nuclear reactor in the midst of all these homes. Like, who wants that? This is a fantasy that everybody is in. And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. So, you don't have a strong opinion. So, one of the things I think, and I want to get back to this because I mentioned it at the beginning. I think it's clear. It's clear, right? We can't continue on the path we are with fossil. And the nuclear option is continuing to kick the can down the road, if you will. So what we'll get into a little bit more in our second panel is how do we shift? How do we make that shift to the renewables with storage as an option with it too, and being critical to it as well. So there has to be, even if the nuclear, I hate to say the nuclear option, if that SMR becomes an option for the future, we got to get there somehow. And I think we are going to agree that right now we've got to look towards the renewables and with storage. But I want to get back to kind of what I started with, which is something that I think was the question that kind of started snowballing into this forum, which is the Virginia Clean Economy Act, passed in 2020, has these very ambitious goals by 2050 between Dominion and others that we get to this zero emissions. Realistically, in the path we're on, is this realistic? What do we have to do to get back on track, or will we be on track? So I want to just open that up a little bit. I'm going to ask, so folks on panel 2, start writing down. I'm going to ask you the same question. But it's, is that going to be, where are we with that? Because it's all well and good to say, by 2050. And it sounds like it's far off. But there is a point at which you've gone too far to come back and to be able to meet that. Ivy?
Yeah, so part of the issue here is that the problem is being caused by data centers, but they are not showing up in public forums in the General Assembly. They are not asking the SCC for the right solutions. We know that given their political power, they could make this happen. And they are at the moment in such a competition to develop artificial intelligence that all they want is as much power as possible. What I would like to see happen is legislation. It's been proposed the last 2 years, hasn't made it yet, but conditioning the huge amount of subsidies they get on them sourcing their own clean energy. And it's a popular idea. So, I mean, it's a kind of an obvious thing. They are now getting $1 billion in tax subsidies from us taxpayers, and we are getting nothing in return. It is not that hard to say, in exchange, you are to go out and from anywhere in PJM, source your own clean energy on a 24/7 basis from wind, solar, energy storage, anything that's renewable and zero carbon, then that will include legacy nuclear plants because they are zero carbon. It's probably not going to include SMRs because it's a lot cheaper to do wind and solar. But this is not that hard a concept. It really putting the onus on the people who are making the problem to solve the problem. And I think it's a pretty straightforward solution. It would mean that we're back, the rest of us are following the track of the VCEA, which we know is completely achievable in the time. In fact, we could do it faster than that for all the rest of the load. So I don't think that the VCEA needs to be changed. We just need to have the data centers step up.
So what is happening right now is that there are transmission lines being built into places that have clean energy, like Pennsylvania, which is the MDRP, which one? It's from Peach Bottom in Pennsylvania, comes through Maryland, and picks up some gas and then terminates into Data Center Alley. But along that transmission line are people like you who bought homes, who didn't think that they would ever have their property seized for somebody else's power need. So we have to be cautious when we start talking about where are they pulling this energy from. The underlying principle back in 2016 from the coalition of this line extension policy was that we believed that if the data center industry had to pay for their own transmission, and by the way, had to bury it as well in order to protect people from the overhead harms, they had to pay for their own generation, all this nuclear, they would be forced to innovate. I do not see the Virginia Clean Economy Act surviving, because either way, I don't think you can source it now with enough renewable energy within PJM. The other problem is that these places that they're pulling it from, like Pennsylvania, raise your hand if you think they are now being inundated with data centers. Name a state in PJM where they are not being inundated with data center projects. It's happening everywhere. What needs to happen is no. What needs to happen is our public utilities, with the support of the SEC and our elected leaders, start looking out for us. And I don't say this like I'm some crazy activist. I really do believe that this kind of scale of power, this cumulative impacts, if we try to meet the demand, we're not addressing the harm they are causing in other ways.
Okay. Are there other issues that we didn't raise, or things that we've talked about here that we want to bring up right now? You and I were talking a little bit earlier on some of the issues with the taxes and others. I mean, I think you've covered this, yeah.
The tax incentives issue. And I do say, I do think if you actually tell the data centers they have to do this, I think we probably would have fewer data centers. I think they would find that there were some other states they'd rather go to. But this is a national problem, and the rest of the country is looking to us for leadership. And so I don't think just pushing them out of Virginia does it. I think we do have a systemic problem.
So I think right. I think there's accountability. I mean, there's going to be an accountability issue, whether they're here or whether they're in another state. But why is it that you think that they're not being held accountable right now, or there's not this push? I know this is a huge question, right? But I mean, what is it? We said, but if they were made to meet these standards, if they were this, but what is what is it? When if I was to give you, give me a 30-second, what is it, or what it would have to change?
So being an energy nerd, I tune in to meetings of the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation, which is our legislators from the House and Senate Energy and Commerce Committees working on big issues of energy. And they had a program on solar siting. So solar siting is a huge issue in Virginia. Everybody wants data centers. Nobody wants to host the projects that would create energy. This is particularly a problem in rural Virginia. I watched a county supervisor's hearing at which they approved a 1,200 megawatt huge data center campus, and in the very same meeting turned down a solar farm. So see, the commission has this hearing. They're talking about solar farms. There is not a single peep out of anybody from the data center industry. Question came up that required a comment from data centers, and somebody from the Data Center Coalition who was standing in the way back got called on and said, basically, we'd rather deal with this one-on-one. So they were not going to get involved in the fight over how to produce the energy they want. And we're seeing this time and again that they are not going to the General Assembly and saying we want clean energy. They are not going to the State Corporation Commission and saying it's really important to us that we have renewable energy. But they want all the credit from the public when they say we have sustainability goals or we're buying renewable energy. We're just not seeing them step up.
So is there a question about whether it's about more information into the public? Because I've heard from folks, well, if they're going to build this data center, why don't they just put the solar panels on the roof? And my somewhat flippant response to that is to keep the lights on in the restrooms, because that's about what you're going to be able to do with it. But I think people have heard, right? We've been pushing residential solar. Is you can, go off the grid. You put it on your roof, you can go off the grid. You can sell it back. You can have zero, all it costs you to, with Dominion is what it costs you to be hooked up to the grid. Is there maybe a misconception that translates to a massive data center, or is just not really an understanding that how much computing power you need when you start running ChatGPT?
Right. If you put solar on the roofs of the data centers, it might provide 1 or 2%, that's something. They should be doing it, if nothing else, than to show that they are engaged. Probably of more interest is the idea that the rest of the economy could be helping here if we had more incentives for the rest of us to have rooftop solar and home energy storage and smart thermostats and smart appliances. We could be saving a fair amount of electricity and saving it at the peak times when the demand is high, and otherwise, you've got very high costs for peak power. You'd have to be asking the data centers to ratchet back, which is another concept that the data centers more or less have rejected, but it's in discussion. But there are things that you could do on a holistic basis to free up more energy. I don't know that it can reach the same scale that we're talking about, but it is. It can reach that peak demand, and the peak demand is a huge, huge part of it.
So I happen to have solar on my property. I live in a more rural area of Prince William County, and we are, although we feed into the grid, which on some level I think, how many data centers are taking my power? But we do feed into the grid, so I'm a big proponent of residential solar. I don't actually agree that we should be producing industrial scale solar on good farmland in our rural areas that provide other resources, watershed management, that rural landscape that makes Virginia beautiful. So I believe we should be putting solar on top of malls, on top of commercial buildings. We should be incentivizing every single residential customer to be able to get solar on their roofs, to really promote that. But this industry, when you have one campus, like I have a campus down the road from me, it's on 100 acres. And their power demand is 585 megawatts. That's enough for 144,000 homes on 100 acres. There's another campus across the street, AWS, and they demand, I think it's 360. On 150 acres, you're talking nearly 1,000 megawatts, which is 1 gigawatt. You would have to, I think it's in translation for solar, 1 megawatt, I believe, is 10 acres. So when you think about the scale that has to occur, those people in rural places, those are still our neighbors. And I don't think that they should be supporting what's happening here necessarily in Northern Virginia, although now it's happening everywhere. I believe there is a way that we have to start communicating to our elected leaders and to the data centers that, bring your own power, bring your own renewable power, and you got to build it on site. And Ivy and I both know that's never going to happen. But there has to be someone. We do not have enough time. If you are really here, you believe there's a climate issue, we need to be clear that mowing down mature forests, taking out good soil that helps to capture carbon, that's not the way forward either. I really believe we have to start having the conversation, and we need to flip the equation. They demand so much. Why are we willing to harm so much of Virginia and other places to make that happen? There has to be another way.
Thank you, Elena. That was a great transition to our second panel.
Well, you are welcome.
So again, Ivy and Elena, thank you so much. We're gonna move on to our second panel now. So I'm gonna ask. Thank you. And we will do some questions at the end. So I'd like to welcome Jim Pericle, Louise Ortiz, and Ann Bennett to the stage to take spots, and I'm going to do the other duties as assigned by pulling out another chair. Anywhere you like. Well, welcome. So, as I did before, I'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourselves as you feel comfortable doing. So, we'll just go down the line. Ann?
Hi, first of all,
Oh, I'm sorry. That was the one thing I was supposed to remember to do. The one thing they told me to do. Okay.
First, I just want to thank you for having this forum. It's great to have facts in the mix of data centers. My name is Ann Bennett. I am the land use chair for the Great Falls group of Sierra Club, and that's how I got involved with data centers originally when we were part of a coalition to, let's say, improve or fight the digital gateway in Prince William County. That's where I met Elena. I also now, because this work is so fun, chair the Sierra Club chapter's data center practice and have learned a lot along the way.
I am Luis Ortiz. I'm an assistant professor of climate applications at George Mason University. I work a lot to understand this sort of interface between what we build and the air around what we build and the impacts on people's health, on energy, and all sorts of sectors of the economy.
I'm Jim Purical. I'm a director at Advanced Energy United, and Advanced Energy United is an industry trade association whose mission is 100% clean energy. And we're based in about 18 and 19 states to include Virginia. I've been with Advanced Energy, and so one thing about our technology is it's multi-platform, multi-technology. So, what seems to be more commercially viable today is of course solar, wind, battery storage. We're not against nuclear or fusion, but for many of the same reasons too that Ivy mentioned, we're still waiting for them to see if it's going to be commercially viable and economical. I'll also say that I'm based out of Norfolk, Virginia, and so this state is actually very, very much near and dear to my heart. I've only been with Advanced Energy United for about 2 years now. I've been in this capacity for about a year. It's been a pretty good growing curve so far, a learning curve so far too. So, but it's really been exciting working in this state. So, thank you for having us here.
Thank you all. Jim, I'm going to start with you actually. So, because currently Dominion has to require to provide all the energy that they're requested. Can you talk a little bit about what role, obviously, renewables can play? We talk about that, but the importance of moving towards the renewable and the importance of the battery storage being part of the equation. How do we move away from the fossil fuels, move more towards renewables?
Yeah, Ivy had mentioned about the industry being under attack, the renewable energy industry, right, really being under attack by the federal government. But we are really at an inflection point right now. So I'm not sure how many people have heard of Lazard. Lazard is a financial management and asset firm. I see some shaking heads here. And Lazard's, they're really focused on banking services and asset firm management, but they put out an annual report called the levelized cost of energy, or levelized cost of electricity. It's an input, it's a factor, but it's a pretty good, it sets a pretty good temperature for how much electricity from various generating sources costs. And what we're seeing now, which is phenomenal, folks, is the reduction of the cost associated with specifically utility scale solar, but more importantly also with battery storage. And battery storage has the costs associated with battery storage have decreased about 40% just in the last 12 months, and they're on scale to decrease even more. And and onshore wind is also, we're talking about, when it comes to dollars per megawatt hours, we're talking about for utility scale solar, and I'll talk to residential solar, probably in another question here too, but specifically utility scale solar, because the cost runs around $38 to $78 per megawatt hour, and we don't need to get lost in the units per se, and then onshore winds ranges from about $37 to about $86 per megawatt hour, and then battery storage, you have a larger range that goes from about $50 to $131 per megawatt hour. And you compare that extremely competitive to combined cycle gas, which ranges from about, a larger range from about $38 to $107, right? Then the gas peaker plants that Ivy was talking about, because they range somewhere, they start at like $149 and range up to $215 per megawatt hour. The reason that that's important is because now, today, and present, and what we're seeing in the near term and potentially the long-term future, is this cost of utility scale associated with this standalone battery storage. And by the way, the number that I gave you, $50 to $131 for the battery storage piece, that's standalone battery storage. That doesn't even include the synergies that you get when you combine that kind of storage with utility scale solar. And so you can expect somewhat about a 10% decrease in cost, right? And so when you look at that, now you're like, oh man, are you telling me that I can use the sun to create an electron and hold onto it until a time that I really need it? That's revolutionary. Thomas Edison would be blowing in his mind right now, right? And so if we can capitalize on, if we can really leverage that, then I see our potential being unlimited. But it does run into a lot of the same issues that Ivy was talking about, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But the point that I'm really foot stomping is that when you look at the affordability piece of it, it's really a no-brainer. And especially when you compare it with the other types of what we call fossil fuel generation plants. So the affordability piece, and then employability. You can't build new gas here before within the next 5 or 6 years. It's just physically impossible, and doesn't even include the type of permitting that you're going to have to go through, right? Ivy mentioned the siting issues, and we'll touch upon that, I'm sure, here, but this type of technology that you can get from renewables is here today. And we're not talking about, this is not pie in the sky. This is technology that can be implemented potentially here within the next year to 18 months. And so when you consider the affordability component, the employability component, and oh, by the way, I haven't even talked about the fact that it's clean energy, right? And so there's the societal costs that come with this type of energy too. And the stability, we have gotten to a point where we can predict when the sun's going to shine, when the wind is going to blow, right? We can't always predict if there's going to be a crisis in Ukraine that's going to create volatile prices for gas, right? So, and so those are the 3 foot stompers I think that I really want to focus on too, and where I see as advantageous for the renewable energy and the clean energy sector.
So I do have a follow-up, but I want to ask, do you either want to bring a comment on this question or talk about what Jim has said as well?
I just want to share some data to sort of say why this is so important. Virginia is now the #1 importer of fuel in the nation, okay? And that's because of the data centers, and that's not clean fuel. And last year, some of you may be familiar with the JLARC study, which came out of the General Assembly. It was a great study. It told us a lot of the things that we had been seeing on the ground for a long time, put some numbers to it, but those numbers are low. Those were based on history, on some calculations that they were able to do, but our understanding right now for the projects that we have data for, which is about half in terms of the energy requirements, we're going to need 60 gigawatts. That's for about half of the projects that have been proposed. Now, we can't tell how big the market will be, but in order, if these data center operators want to deploy as quickly as they can build these buildings go up in months, okay? But they, as was said here, you can't get the energy so fast. So the renewables are so important in order to meet demand in the time frame in which these companies want to be working.
I mean, is this come down to, obviously it would be cheaper for the data centers we're talking the renewables, if they were on the hook for most of the cost or more of this, but because it's spread out across everyone and disproportionately to residential, other payers, that there's not an incentive to move towards this. It's almost like because it's everybody's problem, it's nobody's problem.
Well, to be fair, they are looking for power anywhere they can find it. So it's sort of an and situation. I mean, I just read that their Digital Realty is procuring hydropower in West Virginia. Now, Digital Realty is not one of the biggest players that we normally think about. They're very big in Loudoun, but who would have thought? New hydro in West Virginia? But that's how desperate they are. And you'll see the big operators contracting for big solar contracts, even in Canada. So they are trying to meet certain goals, but they're not meeting them. They just need too much. The math just doesn't work on a certain level. It's really challenging.
So does this become, if down the path we're going, more importing of fuel and power until it's unsustainable?
I mean, right now, natural gas is the bridge fuel to the SMRs. And I'm not saying that's viable, but that's the quote-unquote plan.
I'll push back on that, I think, a little, and because so natural gas was designed to be that transition point actually to renewables, right?
I'm not saying I advocate for it.
No, I get that. Yeah, I know.
That's been the default position
yeah,
of our policymakers.
So, yeah, right. And so I'm going to confound, I think, some expectations out there also, right? Because, and it keeps coming back to this, the cost of storage. And I want to make sure I correct that too, right? I told you from Lazard, I think I'd said 38, but it's $50, right? $50 to $131 per megawatt hour, right, is what we're talking about for standalone battery storage, right? And the reason, again, that this is important is because that was not forecasted to be that way 2 or 3 years ago. This is really something that has only developed in the last 12 months. Now, and so natural gas was supposed to be that transition, getting into recyclables and clean energy, right? And now we're there. I think we're there. And regardless of what the federal administration wants to do. And by the way, the numerical values that I gave you are excluding the federal tax incentives. So yes, it would help if federal tax incentives were there, but we still feel like that these forms of energy are very competitive. And so, in answer to your question, do we think that we're going to be able to get there? Do we think that we're going to have to keep importing more fuel? And I would push back and I would say, if we can solve for actually getting these projects, large-scale projects, actually in the ground, then I think that we can cut back on the amount that we're actually importing. But one thing that I didn't tell you also that Advanced Energy also looks at are other forms of efficiencies, so transmission, and finding more efficient ways. And I don't want to take up too much time here on the stage too, because I can talk about this also throughout the rest of the panel. But 3 terms that I want to push out to you all is grid enhancing technologies. We call them GETs for short. And basically that's using existing infrastructure. Advanced Energy United really likes to look at the existing infrastructure and seeing how we can make that effective, really more efficient. And so grid enhancing technologies, they look at topology, it looks at dynamic power flow rating. So basically, it makes the power going through transmission lines more efficient, right? And that's more affordable way of transmitting those electrons. Another second term, surplus interconnection. You're going to be hearing a lot more about this. And the reason is because up until recently, up until January of this past year, PJM, the Regional Transmission Organization or operator that was discussed at the first panel, PJM did not allow flexible assets like solar and wind and battery storage to be co-located on their fossil fuel generating facilities. Okay. Other RTOs were doing this. This past January, PJM updated their rules and said, okay, we're good with this now. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, blessed off on the modernization of PJM's rules just back in August. And so what this allows us to do now, if you think of these fossil fuel plants as a grocery store, where they're not operating at their max capacity. They're rated at a certain capacity, let's say like at a gigawatt or so, but they're not using a gigawatt. The only time they'll ever really use a gigawatt is if there's a power outage of some sort, right? And it's similar to your car. Your car is rated at 140 miles an hour, let's say, but you never really drive it at 140 miles an hour, right? So, and so going back to the shopping, the grocery store analogy, right? There's one lane that's open in your checkout. There's one checkout aisle open. If we can open up some more of the checkout aisles by putting in equating the analogy here is by putting solar, storage, wind on those fossil fuel facilities, now we have a lot more flexibility. And it's coming out of clean assets now. So that's surplus interconnection. And then the third term, which I'll get into a little bit later, virtual power plants. And so I'm sure we'll be talking about that in a little bit more.
Thank you. And let's talk about water. So I'm just going to put a figure, but I'm going to qualify it. So data centers in Northern Virginia used about 1.85 billion gallons of water. What that really means, it was a 64% increase over 4 years between 2019 and 2023. Obviously, with more data centers, it will increase the need for water for cooling. Can you talk a bit about what does this mean for our local reservoirs, what it also may mean in other parts of the state, and what it could mean for, we're facing more and more drought conditions over time. We're facing more and more severe weather events. We're facing more and more heat waves or heat emergencies in Fairfax County, for example, and the surrounding counties than we ever have before. And so can you speak a little bit to this with the Sierra hat?
Yeah, sure. So this is, to me, really the next level issue that we all have to deal with. I think we have a decent understanding of the land use issues, and we are gaining a pretty good understanding of the energy issues as well. Not that we can solve them as we've heard here, but water is really complicated, and as data centers are increasingly using more power, they're using for AI that they need to pull more power to run their servers. The air cooling that traditionally they relied on no longer works. So they have turned to water as the cooling source. And, as Chris said, the numbers are mind-boggling. And water is basically a local issue, right? So these companies are making agreements with localities. And in Virginia, we're unique because we have around 40 localities that are siting data centers. So that's 40 different entities that are negotiating with these companies, and most of those agreements are not public, so we don't always know. But, what are the issues with water? Obviously, how much potable water does a particular company negotiate for? How much do they use? What technology are they using? Who pays for the infrastructure? These are new water lines. How much are they allowed to get? Will they bear the cost for that stuff? What are the water rates? Oftentimes they pay lower rates, just like with energy, they pay lower rates than we do as residents. So, yes, we are increasingly in drought conditions in Virginia. That doesn't mean that every county is in the same situation. I mean, if you look at Louisa County and perhaps Mecklenburg, they have reservoirs, they have access to water. The issues may not be the same. But up here, for instance, I often look to Loudoun County because they are that big and that much ahead of us here in Fairfax. And Loudoun County's population has increased 17% between 2015 and 2024, and their water usage is up 32%. permits are up like 3,000. And 6 of the 7 top water users in Loudoun County are data centers. The top one is Google. They almost 3% of the water, of the cost of water goes to Google in 2 facilities in Loudoun County. So, and while often Google tries to say they're the great partner with the environment, they are incredibly water intensive in multiple states. So first of all, we need to know these are public utilities. Like, we're part of that, right? These are public utilities, and we actually don't often have the information that we need, both to tell how much water they've been given and what the rates they're paying and what the impact on us. So one of the reasons Sierra Club was interested in the Digital Gateway development in Prince William County is because that proposal allowed for 37 hyperscale data centers where the major water drainage basin is for about half of Northern Virginia, including me. I'm a Fairfax Water client. That's where we get our water. And so with the incredible increase in impervious surfaces there proposed, issues with water quality and quantity, we just thought it was absolutely ill-advised. That, of course, got approved. It's in litigation now. But these are choices that local jurisdictions are making. And Elena talked about being involved. This is an area where everybody needs to be involved. Loudoun County, there was just a study dropped in Loudoun County about the extent to which the drought conditions have spread, particularly in western Loudoun County. So this is a real problem, and this affects us also, not just our pocketbooks, but maybe, perhaps, our access to drinking water. The state, I'll just add that the state hasn't done a thing. I mean, the state has regional water plans. In fact, they updated it last year, but they also delayed coming back with updated plans until 2029. We do not have time. We need serious decision-making at the state and local level, and they need to collaborate to protect our water and our natural resources.
So you move, obviously, this being water is a public health issue as well. So Dr. Ortiz, I'd like to ask you about, with data centers, has there been studies, at least documentation, of air quality risks, increased risk with backup generators and diesel generators? And I know this was something that you were looking into, trying to even use generators as a gauge for how big certain, observationally, how big certain data centers were. And it was like detective to try to figure out, the impact. But, there are air quality issues. There are, obviously, to a lesser, less obvious, sound quality issues, noise quality issues. I just actually read something popped up on my social media this morning saying, this person was asking, what can I do? This data center nearby is pumping out, and they had their little decibel calculator, 80 decibels, 24/7. How can this get? I didn't even know these things were a problem until this. So I think people are realizing, they're seeing these effects. They may not necessarily, now that it's happening right next door to them, they're seeing these issues, and obviously it's causing some issues with stress in this case, or potentially sleep. So can you talk a little bit about the health effects, both direct, which we can say, oh yes, that's from an air quality, and indirect, some that you may not.
I'll answer your first question about studies specific to data centers.
Yeah.
Shockingly few, especially on the health side. However, we do know quite a bit about the stuff that comes out of the diesel power plants, the gas power plants, basically everything. Every time we burn something, we know quite a lot about the stuff that comes out, and we've been studying the effects of that stuff on human health for decades now. In fact, that's why we have an EPA, and we have this list of chemicals and stuff in our air that we call criteria pollutants that we are required to track in pretty high spatial detail. So we know quite a lot about that, and we know that a lot about Virginia's source of energy. We talked quite a little bit about that already today, which is mostly natural gas, but we also import significant amount of energy. In fact, we're the lead importer of energy in the United States, and we know that a lot of what we import has a lot of coal in it. And I believe, did the last coal power plant in Virginia close down recently? Is that... we had very little coal in Virginia to begin with, and it's on its way out, but we still have fossil fuel. And we can categorize a lot of that, all the material or the byproducts of fossil fuel combustion into either particulate matter, basically anything that has a diameter about 1/30th of a hair. The size is important because it can get deep into your respiratory system, and it's probably the most studied pollutant that we have because we have very clear indications of the effects it has on human health. It's related to higher rates of respiratory illness, cardiac illness, and for a very, very long time, it's led to large portions of the population, especially those who are sited near power plants, to be subjected to those pollutants, and those populations often have higher mortality rates, higher hospitalization rates, higher asthma rates. There is one good story here. Since the passing of the Clean Air Act and since regulations enacted in the early to mid-2000s, air quality has actually improved for the most part in the United States. So that's a huge success story. Locally, I don't know if that's always the case, and data centers have the capacity to locally affect their air quality through their backup generators, which I think were mentioned already. A lot of them are powered by diesel, which is a particularly, or the byproducts of combustion of diesel are particularly noxious. We're talking about the same particulate matter. We're talking about nitrous oxides, which have a whole host of other health problems. One of them being one of them is a precursor to ozone, which is another air quality issue. So it can even have air quality effects, even when it's not being directly impacted or being directly emitted by the diesel generators. And a whole host of other chemicals like benzene, formaldehyde, which are less studied, but generally we know that we don't want to be introducing those into our air supply. So we know that, and we know that even though they're not constantly running these backup generators, they do have permission to run them periodically, about once a month, to test them, so they know that they can operate them when they need. We also know that when there's a blackout or when the grid gets too stressed, for example, during a heat wave, everyone cranks up their AC, cost of energy goes up or demand for energy goes up, and they might be incentivized to get off the grid, turn on their backup generators because it's cheaper for the grid to do that. So during those periods of times, people might actually be more susceptible to the effects of all these gases that we're spewing from these generators. So even though it's not a constant the population being subjected constantly to these pollutants, they are periodically being subjected to them. And studies have shown that even acute and short-term exposures can have significant health effects on communities. And this is doubly true for the very, very young and for the very old, or people who have pre-existing conditions like respiratory and heart conditions. You mentioned noise, which is regulated to a certain extent. I recently learned there was a Noise Act of the 1970s that places some controls on noise pollution. However, it only regulates a relatively narrow band of noise, typically very loud, like very high-pitched noises, stuff like that, which is not what we get from data centers. Usually have like a hum from the HVAC or air conditioning running full time, basically. And even though those noises don't have the same sort of acute impacts that you might get from those other types of noise pollution, studies have shown that exposure to those sort of low frequency noise can elevate your stress levels, can increase your blood pressure, and of course, if you're over long enough time of that, you can start having heart problems. Stress levels go up. That can also lead to heart problems as well. So it's a lot of chronic issues on the noise side, and a lot of relatively high intensity and periodic issues on the air quality side.
One thing I wanted to just maybe tie together was we're increasingly in need of more and more electricity, more power, and it's unsustainable. And when it's unsustainable, we don't have it now, but we're probably going to see more periods of brownout, more blackout, more going off the grid, which is also a situation in a time when you're using these backup generators. So while they may be fired more now on test, this could be where they're used more on a more regular or more usual basis than one would expect. And what you, Ann, what are your thoughts about that?
I have thoughts. We're there. I mean, we saw it this summer in Loudoun County. We started seeing posts on Reddit and on other next door that people were seeing dirty air spewing from. It happened to be Digital Realty properties because we were able to look at it, and maybe others. But the rules were loosened this summer in late June when the temperatures were high and the grid reached capacity. So those harmful effects that you eloquently explained, this is really what we've been worried about, and we're already here. So the question is, I actually updated the figures for how many diesel generators have been permitted this morning in anticipation of this conversation, and we're over 9,600 in Virginia, 5,000, over 5,000, almost 5,100 in Loudoun alone. So about 8,000 so far in Northern Virginia, in the 4 jurisdictions up here. So if we did the calculation about, what 500, they're usually permitted 500 hours a year, or if they're running 24/7 in highly populated areas. This is not Mecklenburg or Southside Virginia, where population density is far different. These are the most populated parts of the Commonwealth, and we could see, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 of these, and imagine if this becomes the primary power. I think the prospects for harm to human health, particularly with those disadvantaged or more vulnerable populations, it will be a public health crisis.
Just in time.
Just in time.
Thank you so much. There's something I would like to add to your point, which is very, very, very true, and I'd love to have your numbers on the pyramids at some point. So you spoke about times where the greatest stress or there's a blackout. We have options, right? When we do that, go inside, and you typically have some kind of air conditioning inside that will circulate the air. Not if there's a blackout, right? Suddenly our ability to ventilate our indoor spaces becomes compromised. And the traditional advice we might get can become bad for us, because suddenly we have a box where we're accumulating pollutants potentially during these periods of time. Yeah. And same thing happens with wildfires, by the way. It's exactly the same potential issue.
You've been quiet. I'm going to bring you back in.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, we heard this earlier, but we've heard if they want to come here, bring their own power. We know that on-site power is not going to meet the demand. It's going to mainly be a small piece of the energy consumed by data centers. So what are some of the other incentives to increase that, pursue to reduce the economic impact of this on consumers, and also, what are you mentioned the virtual power plant and things like this. So
Yeah,
I want to, people hear these terms, but I think not fully appreciate or understand what they mean.
Yeah. Okay. So let me try and explain. So virtual power plants. This goes back also what was discussed at the last panel. Creating more incentives really for residential and commercial, industrial buildings, really to build more solar and storage. Because now we can, and we're trying to implement actually a virtual power plant program in Dominion territory right now. So what you're able to do now is aggregate all these batteries specifically, right? So envision this. I can charge my battery in the daytime, and now I have a fully charged battery here during the peak hours. Normal peak hours, really run from like 6 to 9 p.m. Dominion has some crazy peak hours that run from like 11 to 9 p.m. I don't know why, but because it's Dominion. But so it's when you associate peak hours, you're really kind of talking about when do people come home from work and start turning on their light switches and running their dishwashers and their microwaves, right? And you can if I have a fully charged battery and let's say a certain percentage of that I'm using to run my appliances, but the rest is a remainder. So myself and my neighbor now, we can pool our batteries together because my other neighbor may not necessarily have a battery. And so now those electrons, they don't have to go over transmission lines, right? They just really, and there's the distribution line now can carry that electron from my house and from Joe's house over to Sue's house. And coupled, also tied into a virtual power plant program. So that's called the aggregation part, is what I talked about just now here too, where you're really just kind of taking all those electrons, those free electrons, and pushing them to where they need to be. But then there's also the demand response element. And this is really, I think, where we can really make some money here with the data centers. And when I say make some money, I mean data centers aren't necessarily operating at full capacity 24/7, right? And so you can take advantage of giving them incentives potentially to reduce their demand at certain hours. Same thing also for our homes. If the temperature is 80 degrees outside and you have a thermostat set at 70 degrees, well, maybe you can crank it up to 71, 72. And you get paid for doing that. This is all demand response. And some people will say, well, why do I want to curtail my electricity? I should have full access to electricity. But even if I live by the ocean, I'm not keeping my water faucet on 24/7, right? So that's you're using what you need at the time that you need it. And even for data centers, you talk about the on-site piece. I think there's better value in looking at what's the choke point. Is the choke point at a substation? Is the choke point at the distribution center? Is the choke point at the data center? And that's really where you want to be building your flexible assets, right? And so I think that there's, and by the way, because of all the investment that's coming out from the data centers, if you start to put solar and storage in your homes, or you start to invest into shared solar, community solar, by another name that it's called, there's a way for you to get part of that incentive mechanism. There's a way for us as consumers to really kind of reap the benefits of that too. So I think there's a way to really make sure that we're all getting a piece of the pie.
And did you want to have any comment on that at all? Okay. Oh, I want to open it up. I want to make sure everyone has equal time for it. I do want to go back to a little bit more on our environmental side. You mentioned we know more about land use and those types of things, but I think what we're seeing is there's more of an impact on the land, on our ecosystems, biodiversity issues here. Wetland, loss of wetlands, farmland that was brought up earlier being used, or other areas, tracts of land just being essentially clear-cut with these massive concrete structures. So, what do you see, kind of the impacts on these communities, and also, what about the communities they're affecting already, right? So, or is this going to be stressing communities that have already been stressed?
On a certain level, we are seeing an industrialization of the countryside. There's no question. You just need to go not too far west of here to see, what the impact of 300 data centers is. And Prince William you can see it there as well. We're looking at over 100,000 acres just for data center development. I always say if you add on the warehouse development, you can, see the kind of investment we have in construction in this state. I might disagree a little bit with Elena on because we never really complain about losing all those acres for the actual construction of the buildings. We often hear lots of complaint about the solar, which actually has a very different impact. So we'll agree to disagree on that. But we're talking about a lot of lost acreage, and if you look at places like Caroline County or Spotsylvania County, where you're seeing in Stafford, where you're seeing also incredible data center. I mean, basically with the Amazon deal, the $35 billion deal, those large campuses are mostly in the rural areas, and many of them are on wetlands. And so you'll see at a campus of 8 or 10 data centers, you could see 6 or 8 stormwater ponds. I mean, like that's the infrastructure we don't always hear about. We don't always hear about the substations. And there could be 20 to 40 acres for one campus devoted just to substations. And also, as I said, huge amount of acreage to capture water. So, what are the impacts on wildlife over time? Nobody's studying it. You can guess, right? We're sort of in a no man's land. But, the tree loss, there's no mitigation. Unless a locality requires, much of this land is forested. So particularly, south of Northern Virginia. So there are no provisions that I know of, and if anyone knows better than this, that requires tree planting to to mitigate for the acres and acres and acres of tree loss. So, and then you've got wildlife impacts with forest loss. So, I mean, it goes on and on. You all know about this. I don't have to say it, but the numbers are so large, and we haven't studied it, but we can imagine really how big the impact is to wildlife and air quality. We talked about diesel generators, but when you lose trees, you lose air quality. So, I think this is an underreported aspect. I think when you look at a project incrementally as an island, and you don't look at regional impacts, you don't look at the state as a whole, this is what you get, a patchwork of industrial development without a clear understanding of the long-term impacts to the environment and to human health.
Yeah, I want to make one point also. I agree with everything that Ann said too, but to the point that she was talking about with respect to the solar siting and the impact of the solar siting, and in response to some of the comments that were made on the first panel, Virginia Commonwealth University had run a study which came out December of last year, weighing the impact specifically of solar siting on the state. And their most aggressive calculation, which basically took into account that 15% of the current or the forecasted load would come from these utility scale solar facilities, and that's an aggressive assessment. And it came out and it said that 0.5% of the forest land would be lost to solar, to utility scale solar. And it's also worth saying that this is low grade forest land. With respect to farmland, came out to or agricultural land, about 2.5 to 2.6% of all of our agricultural land will be lost to solar siting, right? So solar is not the reason why we're losing our forest land and agricultural land, right? And on top of that, what people don't know also is House Bill 206, which went into effect in December of 2024, also requires utility-scale solar developers to replant a portion of the forest land that was lost. If I cut down the forest, the trees on my property and give them to forestry, or give them to another industry, I don't have to suffer that same type of mitigation, or I don't have to go through that same type of mitigation. That is unique to solar siting. And so we're very special in that sense. And one story I will tell is, I don't think that this is a loss of agricultural land. I think that this is a property rights issue, because every one of these solar projects is going on private property for people who want it on their property. Amanda Lloyd had a dairy farm. Her husband actually owned the dairy farm. They closed the dairy farm down back in the 1980s. Her husband passed away about 10 or 11 years ago and left the farm to her. And she's been looking for a way to monetize her property. She looked at solar siting. She lives in Louisa County. And this was an opportunity for her to save something and give something back to her kids. The Louisa County Planning Commission said that she had one of the best applications that they'd ever seen. Project denied. And the reason was because they were afraid of losing their agricultural land. Folks, this is a way for people to monetize their personal property in a peaceful manner. There are regulations that are in place also, and I will agree. I will say that those regulations can be enforced a little bit better, and I think DEQ is working towards doing that. They have been making a lot of progress, but regulations are in place really to make sure that these projects are done in a more responsible fashion. So yeah, I think solar siting is one of those big issues if you want to get more electricity onto the grid.
Could I add a little bit? If there's ever a place for innovation that's already here, it's right there. Agrivoltaics, where you can grow crops and have photovoltaic panels. They've even shown some benefits to yield, to protecting animals that are foraging or eating some of the grassland there. And they've been testing this successfully in Germany and all over the many places in the world. So there are already technologies today to have a little bit of an situation between the generation and the cropland part. So yeah, that's an opportunity there.
Okay. Did anyone have any thoughts, as I'll pose the same question I posed with the first panel, which was achieving the goals of the Virginia Clean Economy Act?
We have to. One thing I haven't told you, I believe in climate change, okay? But what I haven't said to is I was in the Marines for 20 years. I was a helicopter pilot, right? In 2010, I was deployed in Pakistan for a humanitarian assistance mission in southern Pakistan, Panok Hill, and we built a makeshift airway, a runway there, so that we could use this site here to deliver food and water to segments of the population that really had been left for dead, right? And when I was in Panok Hill, the temperature got up to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. That is not the energy index also, the heat index, right? That was just the temperature. The heat index actually got closer to 127. In Iraq, when you're working on the asphalt, you're experiencing temperatures close to about 147 degrees. That's what we are going to suffer from if we don't do something about climate change. The VCEA is not the only tool in the belt, but it is a step that gets us in the right direction. So yeah, we have to.
Anyone else with thoughts?
No, I would just say that I think it's one of the crown jewels, and I know many of you have advocated for it, and it's a responsibility, especially when our elected officials have invited this industry in, literally all over the state. It's really their responsibility to maintain the relationship with the law, and perhaps even strengthen it to address the issues we've talked about here today.
I'll add something. You were wearing combat fatigues at the same time, right? It
was a flight suit, but yeah.
But that's
and
a lot.
Flak and Kevlar. Yeah, it was.
Yeah. I would say, the growth of data centers is not some inevitability or it's not a law of physics that we have to adhere to, right? we have a responsibility to be stewards to the land that we have and to the people who live in these lands, and to reduce harm as much as possible. That includes reducing the climate pollution from fossil fuel gas burning, but also the harmful chemicals. I think it's becoming more challenging, but I think we have a lot of capacity here from the technology side on solar and siting, and if we can remove some of the barriers, that can certainly be accelerated. I'm hopeful, but yeah, it's...
So like a lot of our climate crisis forums, we had one last year on the school systems, it was not meant to be a one and done, right? So it wasn't to be, this is it, and it was meant to start the conversation. So a story here from Facts is that a year and a half ago, there were a team of people that sat down and said, let's come up with our policy and our position on data centers, right? Like it was that simple. And I'm looking at those people in this room who went, okay, so we should consider principles, which is what I think we have, which probably need to be revised and looked at again. But it's kind of guiding, as this is an ever-evolving issue, and there are issues upon issues, right? There's going to be continued discussion, right? If you hear, it sounds, we can do all of this and it's so much cheaper, then why aren't we doing the renewables? Like, what is it about it? We've talked about, we could have a whole nother conversation about when data centers are coming into the communities, what are the monetary effects to the local economies, which are huge, right? And so there is this balance, right? We can't say no more data centers. Like we're not going to have them. We should never have them because we're all using them, right? We're all using them every time we're getting on. And I joke, I'm on Zoom calls and other calls all the time where I'm looking at the AI note taker, right? Or maybe there's 2 or 3 AI note takers running that people have running. That's what's doing it, right? But it's about a tool, right? So it's how do we balance this kind of need for this AI future, but at the same time doing this in a responsible way. So again, it's just I think part of the beginning of the conversation. And I will say that for folks in the room here, for folks that are online, it really requires that we all be a part of this because it's not just happening in Richmond, right? Sure, that's where laws are getting passed, but this is happening like with Elena in her communities. You just stopped, kind of expansion on one campus, right? And it was through, it wouldn't have happened had it not been the citizens going to the Board of Supervisors, right? So, everyone needs to be a part of this since we're all a part of this. And so that's my shameless plug for getting involved with Facts. Doing so, through our advocacy teams that are based and our advocacy director, Brian Scrafford, who's been working at the local level, but has been building our state policy platform and agenda that we're going to be implementing and engaging on starting in January. It's about getting involved, but in your communities, right? So it's talking about if somebody goes, those data centers, well, what is it about? Having those conversations. What is it about that's getting you, or why do you say that? Or I love this, or do you really need to keep generating all these things through AI usage? And just understanding that when we start hearing these numbers, 1.85 billion gallons of water, it's like, what does that mean? It's almost too big to even understand. But when you say it's like more than 65% increase in water usage over 5 years, well, that means something, right? And so I think it's easy for us. We're constantly being bombarded with information. But I think understanding what does a megawatt, what does it mean? Like, how many houses can that power? Starts to make it a little more concrete. So I will say that this is an opportunity to start it. I know folks in here have been very interested and have different degrees of understanding about it, which is why when I hear things like virtual power plants, and I say, yeah, okay, but you have to pause and say, well, what does that mean? What does that really mean? And so for the general folks that are out there, a lot of what they're seeing about this or what it's really impacting them is my earlier example where somebody is like, this hum is driving me crazy next door. Do I call the police about it? It's like, no, you don't. That's not going to, it's too late sometimes to see what's coming until it's there. But I think, these overall, the goals, which again, the Virginia Clean Economy Act is very, ambitious in what it's doing, but we can't lose sight of it and get to 2045 when I go, oops, well, we're not going to make it now. So I do think that there is an ability to, or a need to hold legislators, regulators, and your community leaders to the task on this. So does anyone on this panel have any other thoughts?
Can I just add a very concrete possibility where people, here we are in Fairfax County, and if you all are, those of you who live here, you do have two local actions you can take this month, actually in a couple weeks. One is the policy plan for Fairfax County is going to the Planning Commission, I believe, on October 15th. There are a set of data center policies. They have been substantially weakened since the staff draft came out this summer, including the removal of energy efficiency requirements. We need to talk about that. And some renewable stuff. So the staff had put together a really excellent, strong original draft, and the staff report that came out has been weakened. And so we will certainly be working with the board and the Planning Commission to strengthen that again. Again, this is what local government can do. They are making a choice to limit regulation. That's a choice that I'm sure the industry has requested. The next one is the next night, actually October 16th, before the Planning Commission, is a zoning ordinance amendment on substations. And that is all related to data centers. And I will just say that one of the things that is incredibly weak is that they have a measly 100-foot buffer from residential. Again, that's a choice. The new data center regulations from last year required 300 feet buffer for data centers between residential. This is 100 for a substation. Imagine that. So October 15th and 16th, your voice can and should be heard. If you live in Fairfax County, please be involved in the process. I am happy to be in touch with Chris or anybody else to walk you through it. But just as Elena said, we really need you to show up, and this is an opportunity because they are. While it's good that they're involved, they're regulating to some extent, they could be doing so much more to protect us.
Yeah, and I think, real quick, I would say, a lot of things happening at the regulatory level. These are very large documents, 300 plus pages on the planning run, right? And we were talking about it during a recent online meeting, and someone said, well, I have a 40-page summary. And we said, well, where'd you get that? Do you remember this, Ann?
Yeah, right.
Guys, well, it's an AI summary. So, I mean, But here's the thing. We laugh, but that's this is the importance of a tool like that, right? For the right things, it can be very useful. When you see, and coming from my world doing regulatory work, where I was at the federal level, here's a 1,200-page document for comment and rulemaking. You've got 30 days, and you need to figure it out, right? So, but here's the thing where you have potentially a tool at your disposal, And again, these kind of comments and making statements, they don't have to be done live. They don't have to be done in person for these types of things, right? They can be recorded, they can be written. And so, I think there is a lot about getting involved. And sometimes it's not so obvious how to do it, or it's not the minimum requirements for notice are met, and that's it. So,
one thing I wanted to also add about the VCEA, you're going to hear a lot of folks saying, "Hey, the VCEA is causing your electricity bills to rise." Something about counterfactuals, like what happens if the VCEA was never implemented. Too, what people don't tell you, because that's only half the sentence, is that if the VCEA has actually saved you, and this is Dominion's own integrated resource plan has said that the VCEA has saved $118.5 billion in fuel costs alone, right? So balance that out also with some of this all these other narratives that are attributing rising electricity prices to the VCEA. But Chris, I think you've made some great points here, and thank you all to the people here in this room and the people who are watching online, because you're the ones who are actually getting involved. And I think you all know this is not a black and white issue, right? A 113-page document too, summarized down into 40 pages. These are complicated issues, right? And I'm really grateful for everybody who's here in this room, because you're taking that action to actually get yourselves a little bit more informed.
I will add that there's a cost that nobody even mentioned, or people don't mention very often, is that when people get sick from the air pollution, you go to a doctor, and that doctor gets paid, and that's a cost. It's an economic exchange that happens, right? And that rarely gets counted in these. We did an analysis a few years ago on the VCEA, and it was something in the order of hundreds of millions of dollars saved just in healthcare costs alone by the time it gets implemented. So that's
Health insurance premiums then also,
Exactly.
right? So yeah.
Well, I think you touch on is also something that we hadn't brought up here, which is often the communities that are most affected by these gas emissions, diesel, et cetera, are the ones who are at the most risk, who are already being affected by it, and who are having the negative health impacts, and are also relying on the society to pay for it as well. So I think that's, it's making those communities that are at risk even more at risk. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here and encourage everyone to meet our panelists, to talk to them, ask them questions, get contact information. We will be doing a follow-up on this for folks, some information, and with our links to the recorded version for those that want to share it to those who were unable to attend today. So with that, I want to thank you all, and I hope this...